at the time that this happened, when Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh was targeted for assassination, I don't think that I personally realized at the time what a close call it actually was. And mea culpa on me for not realizing this. You can blame it on the mainstream media, I suppose, because the mainstream media essentially buried this story. And I have an example of this. The New York Times, immediately after this would-be assassin was arrested, thank God, before he had a chance to kill Justice Brett Kavanaugh. This is where they placed it on their front page. We can bring this up on the screen here. This is how they buried their story. And they were not an anomaly. The mainstream media in general hid the story. So way down at the bottom of the page, you can see arrest near home of justice. Well, that's a headline that you read and you don't think about it. It's in one ear and out the other. Arrest near home of justice. Okay, how about assassin tries to kill Supreme Court justice? Or would-be assassin nabbed before murdering the justice that he traveled to kill? I mean, this headline is intended for you to pass over it without even reading it. And it was buried in this tiny little article at the very bottom of the page. Again, this is the New York Times. Mainstream media, as a rule, downplayed and belittled this story the best they could because they didn't want you to think about the implications of this. So sometimes the propagandizing by the mainstream media, unfortunately, quite tragically, is effective. And like I said, I didn't realize at the time what a close call this was because there are a lot of crazies who say a lot of crazy things online, right? And back then, when crazy people said crazy things online, you didn't automatically assume that these people were anything other than lunatics who were spouting what's not okay, not acceptable, and mostly not legal to say, issuing these threats. But in order for a threat to be credible, the person has to have the means and the motive. And there are a lot of crazy people who might have hateful ideology, but they don't really have the capability of pulling that off. At least that's what I thought back then. And so at the time when Brett Kavanaugh was targeted for assassination because of his pro-life stance, he, of course, was part of the panel of Supreme Court justices, the majority that overturned Roe v. Wade. I didn't realize at the time how close Brett Kavanaugh came to being killed by this radical leftist, this man named Nicholas Roske. Now, fast forward several years, and Nicholas Roske was finally sentenced, obviously having been convicted of trying to assassinate Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. Nicholas Roske was sentenced to just 8 years in prison for this crime. Now, if you actually read some of these mainstream media stories, and this is how you know that the mainstream media is just propagating such evil, they actually report quite heavily on the details of this plot against Brett Kavanaugh. They talk about the weapons that Nicholas Roske brought along, the premeditated planning that went into this assassination attempt. This was not some random person who lost their head in the moment and tried to punch out Brett Kavanaugh, as bad as that would be. This was like a very premeditated crime that almost was successful. And the mainstream media included details that showed how almost successful and how premeditated and how motivated by leftist ideology this crime was. And yet, even though they included that in their articles, they headlined it as nothing. Just this passing arrest happened near the home of a Supreme Court justice. It could have been an arrest at the gas station down the street, for all you know, based on the keywords they deliberately neglected to include in their headline. Nicholas Roske deliberately and in a premeditated manner targeted for assassination a Supreme Court justice, Brett Kavanaugh, because of Brett Kavanaugh's pro-life views. And yet, 8 years is the entirety of the sentence that Nicholas Roske has to serve in prison with a lifetime of supervised release. Why? Why is that? Well, I'll tell you why that is. It's because Nicholas Roske now identifies as a woman. Nicholas Roske now identifies as transgender. Nicholas Roske, a biological man, has requested to be called Sophie. We, on the Liz Wheeler Show, will not be honoring that request. Nicholas Roske, who identifies as a transgender woman and wants to be called Sophie and asks to be referred to by she, her pronouns, another request that is denied by this show, was sentenced to 8 years because he is transgender. I am not exaggerating. I am not speaking hyperbolically. I am echoing the words of the judge herself who sentenced him. This judge is named Deborah Boardman. She is a district judge in the District of Maryland. You can see a picture of her on the screen. She's a middle-aged woman. She looks a lot like the women who attend the No Kings rallies. Same demographic, same ideology, we have come to find on the Liz Wheeler show. She looks kind of like the Phillies Karen. You know, the Phillies Karen that excoriated the young man who, the child, he's hardly even a young man, the young boy who had caught the ball that she wanted, and then the father of the young boy gave angry bully Phillies Karen the ball. This judge looks a lot like her. She also actually kind of looks like the doppelganger of the author of White Fragility, Robin DiAngelo. White Fragility, of course, is the book that kind of made critical race theory go mainstream in the United States, or at least introduced critical race theory to white middle-aged women. This is Judge Deborah Boardman. This is what she looks like. She's the one who sentenced the transgender would-be assassin of Justice Brett Kavanaugh, Nicholas Roske, to 97 months in prison and a lifetime of supervised release. Now, your reaction is probably the same as my reaction. The reaction of any common sense individual in this country is to be outraged. Is this justice? Is this fair? Are you seriously trying to tell me that 8 years is all? That's it? That's the whole prison sentence. So if you try to assassinate a Supreme Court justice, you get 8 years. That could almost be described as a slap on the wrist. Thank goodness Attorney General Pam Bondi said the Justice Department would be appealing Roske's prison sentence. Bondi called it woefully insufficient. She is correct on that. But I want to just highlight something. Enrico Terrio was a J6er who wasn't even there at the Capitol on January 6th. And he was sentenced to 22 years in prison for it. Again, he committed no violence. He violated no firearms law. He wasn't even there on January 6th, and yet he was sentenced to 22 years in prison for it. Now, compare that with this transgender individual, this biological man who was identifying as a woman, who tried to assassinate Justice Kavanaugh for Kavanaugh's pro-life ruling in Dobbs versus Jackson's Women's Health, sentenced to 8 years. Listen, don't worry. In case you think that that's injustice, the judge, Deborah Boardman, in the Kavanaugh case, says she hopes that this trial, the process, helped the would-be assassin's family accept him as their transgender daughter. And you thought there wasn't a silver lining to this. And Judge Boardman made the would-be assassin's sentence as light as she did, a mere 8 years, for a very valid reason. Because President Trump won't incarcerate the man in a woman's prison. The judge is worried about his safety if he, as a man, is in a male prison. No worry, though, about the women in the women's prisons if a biological man is incarcerated with them. Don't worry about their vulnerability to assault, especially sexual assault. She's worried about his safety, so she reduced his sentence because she doesn't like President Trump. Okay. In case anyone wonders why all of us on the right, most of us in the center, and some on the left are all Stephen Miller about crime now. This is why. Because the left is quite literally what this judge did. It's not just an isolated, narrow ruling that's unfair or unjust. What she did is she legalized left-wing terrorism. So now people on the left who are committing acts of violence against us, which is happening on a daily basis right now, now she has signaled to them that as long as you have openly embraced a communist ideology, the neo-Marxist ideology of queer theory, as long as you identify as transgender, then you will be held to a different standard. You will get a lighter sentence. You will be actually rewarded by our justice system if you commit violence in the name of radical leftist ideology, as long as you have put on the mantle of transgenderism. She has legalized left-wing terrorism. How many leftists in our country today do you think are saying, well, geez, so next time I throw a brick at a cop, all I have to do before the judge is be like, please call me she, her, and you'll get let out of prison. And by the way, this just brought up again. It's just a reminder how bananas it is that the FBI has not released the name of the person who leaked the Supreme Court ruling on Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health, which was the ruling that overturned Roe v. Wade. Remember that? Somebody within the Supreme Court, and this is a very limited number of people who would have had access to that ruling prior to its official publication, a very small number. Like, they know who did it. And yet they tell us they just can't figure it out. They just don't know. They just don't want, I don't know, they don't want that person to be vilified. It's just a reminder that not only are they lying to us because they think they can get away with lying to us and protecting the person who leaked that, but the leaking of Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health wasn't just because that person was mad. It wasn't just because the person was probably a clerk at the Supreme Court, right? It wasn't just because an employee of the Supreme Court thought you should know a couple of weeks, a month, 2 months before the actual ruling was issued. The reason that the leaker leaked Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health was to spark violence against the Supreme Court justices who had signed on to that majority opinion. And so, circling back to the beginning, I may not have realized at the time just what a close call it was, what a near miss this attempted assassination of Brett Kavanaugh was. And shame on me for not recognizing that at the time. But what I can recognize for a fact right now is that we need to know the name of the person who leaked that opinion. And I understand actually that the Trump administration probably doesn't want to bring it back up because they don't like to talk about abortion, because it's a divisive topic among Trump's base, because some of us are more pro-life personally than President Trump. People like me recognize that despite that, President Trump is still the most pro-life president that we've ever had in this country, and I greatly appreciate that. But it's true that personally and politically, I'm more pro-life than Trump. They don't like to talk about abortion because it becomes a divisive issue, not just right versus left, but even among the right. I don't care. We have got to find out who leaked that Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health majority opinion, because it led directly to the very close call, the assassination attempt against Brett Kavanaugh. There's simply no argument that the assassination attempt followed that because of that. No argument.